Now that we've set up our audio unit elements, we can use them in our next function where we're actually going to connect our nodes together. So as always, we're going to run our check error function, and inside of it is going to be the API function AUGraph connect node input. And this function inside the parentheses takes 5 arguments, and the first one is the graph which we're adding the nodes to, which is our audio graph with the exclamation. Since we have to unwrap it, it's an optional, remember that question mark? Yep, so that's why we use the exclamation. And then our second argument is the in-source node, so basically the synth node, because we're connecting that as the input to our output node. And then third is the in-source output number. We want to output to the speakers, so we use our synth output element, which is going to be 0. And then fourth is our output node itself. That's the in-dest node, in destination. So that's going to be our output node. And the in-destination input number is going to be our audio unit, our synth audio unit as a whole. So that's why we use our IO unit input element. And this should properly connect all of our nodes together and connect them to the graph as well. So it might look something like this. You can see how all of the nodes are connected together, so the audio goes right through them, and they're also on the graph now and connected as well. Now that we got our nodes connected, we need to actually start the audio graph to start the audio processing, and we use 2 functions to do that. The first function is AUGraph initialize, and of course we pass our audio graph again as an argument. I don't know if I need to keep saying that we need that exclamation there, so don't forget it. And then next function, AUGraph start, again pass our audio graph. And then you should be good, but there's still some more work we got to do with the other functions we created earlier. Now we got our graph set up, I want you guys to scroll down to your load SoundFont function. And before we get going on this, I wanted to explain what a SoundFont actually is. It's just like any other file. It has a file name, which is kind of a brand name for the file, which is a SoundFont. That's what they call it. It's kind of like a font on the computer, I guess. But it's for sound. We're going to be using a SoundFont that's already included in the project. I put the project on my GitHub, if you remember, and if you download that one, it already has the SoundFont included. So hopefully it should work when you guys try to use it. But if it doesn't, just let me know what errors you're getting in the comments below, and I'll try to help you the best I can. But if you're good, we can continue on with the next steps. We need to load our SoundFont. The first step we're going to do to load our SoundFont is we're going to create a new property. And this property is going to be equal to bundle.main.url, basically accessing the URL instance member of whatever class. And this instance has a couple of arguments. The first for resource, and this is going to be the file name inside of those quotations. So if you have it in the project, it should be fluid r3_gm. But whatever SoundFont you use in the future, just make sure you have that SoundFont file name inside those quotations. And then you shouldn't have the SF2 in there. You should only have the file name, because the second argument with extension is where we add that SF2 and make sure it's in the proper format and it looks just like how the file does, but there's no dots. All you need to do is say SF2 and it already knows the extension. And if everything works, now we can properly use this property a little bit later to access our SoundFont. Now that we've set up our SoundFont URL, we can actually use it in the next function. So of course, we're going to do check error, and inside of this function, we're going to run another function from Apple's API called audio unit set property. And what audio unit set property does is it sets a specific property of an audio unit. And our synth audio unit has a property called soundbank URL. So this is how we can set the soundbank URL of our synth audio unit. So we do audio unit set property, and then the first argument is the audio unit that we want to set the property on. So in this case, we do synth unit, And we do that exclamation instead of the ampersand because we already have a value. We've already loaded the address for our synth unit. So we just unwrap it in this case. Don't do the ampersand, but use exclamation mark after. And then the next argument is audio unit property ID, which is the property we're trying to set. And inside those parentheses, we're going to put K music device property underscore soundbank URL because that's the property we want. And then third argument, audio unit scope, and then in those parentheses, K audio unit scope global. And make sure you have all the capitals and lowercase. It is case sensitive, so make sure you got that. And then next argument is 0 because we're using the whole audio unit. That's why we do global and then 0 because 0 is the global element. And then second to last argument, we're going to ampersand and then our bank URL. That gives the address and location of our URL that we just gave. And then finally, we're going to give the memory of our URL, the memory size. So we do that by doing uint32, unsigned integer 32. And then inside the parentheses of that, we're going to do memory layout and then those caret symbols, less than or greater than. Inside those, you put URL, just like you would parentheses, but make sure to use those other brackets. And then at the end, dot size. And this right here is going to give the size of the data we're setting the property with. And then make sure you have all those closing parentheses. And now we've just successfully set up our sound font. So we've looked at the load patch function and looked at the arguments it takes in, the patch number, but we never actually looked at what's inside this function. So inside the function, there's 3 properties. One is a constant, the channel, of course, what the MIDI is going through. And then the 2 other properties, enabled and disabled, are just regular variables and they're numbers. So enabled is going to be 1 and disabled is going to be 0. And then whenever we load this function, we're going to set that patch variable that we created in the beginning of this video. We're going to set that variable equal to the current patch number that the function is loading. In this function, we're going to be using a couple other important functions. And again, we're going to be using the audio unit set property function. And of course, you should know the first argument is our audio unit that we're setting the property to. And we just unwrap that with exclamation. And then the second argument is our audio unit property ID again. And this is going to be KAU MIDI synth property enable preload. Now what does that mean? I'll give you the definition that Apple gives you real quick here. So here's Apple's definition of this property in the code. They say setting this property to 1 puts the MIDI synth in a mode where it will attempt to load instruments from the bank or file when it receives a program change message. And this is used internally by the music sequence, which I don't think we'll be using, but it should only be used prior to MIDI playback and must be set to 0 before attempting to start playback. This explains why we have 2 variables, enabled, which is 1, and disabled, which is 0, because that's going to allow us to change the status of this property. Now that we know what enable preload does, let's move on to the third argument of our set property function, which is our scope, of course. This is going to be the global scope. And after that, we of course put 0 because it's going to use the global element. And then finally, the fourth argument, we're going to use the data as enabled. So this is going to enable that property. And then lastly, we need to get the memory of that data we just set in. So we need to use that same uint32 memory layout, uint32.size. And make sure you have all those ending parentheses. And next, we'll move on to a variable called the program change command. Now, what exactly is this? And what are all those numbers like 0xC0? Let me explain this.